Hi, thanks for the introduction. I agreed to talk about a couple of things. One is the concept of rewilding in Agile, and the other is crisis management, and they sort of string together. So if you go back, and we're about to hit two significant anniversaries, one from my own point of view. Next month registers the 21st anniversary of the Canavian framework, which is used extensively within Agile. And next year is the 20th anniversary of the Agile Manifesto. Now, if we go back to that 20th anniversary, and I can get Siri on my watch to switch off. Sorry about that, if that came in the background. If we go back to that 20th anniversary, a group of actually white males, there's a story there on the female side which has to be told sometime, got together and came up with a manifesto, which was largely designed to correct a series of issues or errors within the way that IT development was happening. It was a mixture of XP, DSDM, and other groups. And of course, what's fascinating about Agile is it didn't really scale until Scrum came along. And this is a constant tension in any new movement. If you want the sort of originality, the excitement, the novelty, then it doesn't necessarily scale. It's not until somebody codifies the method or the tool or the approach that you get significant scaling. Now, that actually has a problem, and this goes back to a guy called Max Boasso, who's one of the pioneers in knowledge management, regrettably died prematurely a few years ago. In that what actually happened there, he created this framework which goes abstraction, codification, diffusion. So if you simplify the language so that everybody understands the same language, that's abstraction. If you codify it, i.e. you write it down, you structure it, if you can combine those two, you get rapid diffusion within the market. But of course, that involves considerable loss. So the codification was critical to the expansion of growth in Agile. But it also meant that the thing became highly structured, and now we get the sort of Agile wars. Yeah? From that, Agile has now moved on to areas like HR, and even to some extent on corporate strategy. Now, to some extent, I find all of this a little bit ironic, because every time I hear somebody speak about agility in HR, about the need for the ability to repurpose people, for people to be prepared to move careers, I'm just reminded of the 3 times I've heard those sort of talks before. It happened in the 80s with the introduction of business process reengineering, which again codified a previous method. It happened with the introduction of knowledge management. It happened with the introduction of learning organization. And it's kind of like the agenda hasn't moved on. The same is true in corporate strategy, where the need to be agile has always been around. I've served in corporate strategy. Agile at the moment is suddenly rediscovering communities of practice, which was a common defining technique of knowledge management in the 1990s and failed for a whole series of reasons. But the people adopting it now have not learnt the lessons from the past. Now, I could go on at length about this, but one of the advantages of being in your mid-60s is you've seen the cycles come and go, and you've seen that there isn't a amount of huge difference between them despite the claims. So one of the things I started to do with the Canavian framework, I say over 21 years ago now, was to try and create a both and, not an either or culture. So we need to stop producing those 2-column charts on which the left has all things which are evil and the right has all things which are good, and start to talk a lot more about what's called bounded applicability. So where do some things work and where do some things don't work? So if I look at that in very simple terms, in Agile, in software development, there are whole areas where there's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall. If you're doing large corporate infrastructure projects, if you're in the telecommunications industry, there are projects you need to do which are going to take 2 or 3 years, which have known outcome, against which you can find different types of resource and budget. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I remember working with Telstra in Australia, and their problem was they had waterfall projects, but because nobody got promoted unless they were being agile, they started to invent one-year sprints so that they could say they were agile anyway. And that sort of cynical gaming is inevitable. So this concept of both and is to say that agile as a software development tool has applicability, but then the different methods within agile work in different domains. So the great strength of Scrum, for example, is it takes an idea which is partly formed, and through a series of iterative sprints, it actually creates something which in Cynefin terms is complicated, which is structured, which can replicate. And its strength is that ability to reduce uncertainty through an iterative process of codification. The trouble is you then try and make it universal. And no method or tool is universal in that respect. Some of the work we're doing, for example, on what are called pre-Scrum techniques within Agile, look at things like how do you identify and map unarticulated needs, either things that people don't know that technology can do for them, therefore they don't know how to ask for them. And that's very difficult to fit into a traditional Agile format. This is kind of like next generation design thinking. So it's how do you match unarticulated needs of users with existing capability that you can rapidly and definitively repurpose. So all of these things work in different ways, yeah, and that's kind of like the point I'm making. We're experimenting at the moment with what are called trios, in which you put experienced systems architects or end user system testers together with young, bright programmers and users trained to talk to IT people. That's a threesome. And you deploy 15 or 20 trios at a problem over a couple of weeks to see what they come up with. And then you synthesize the results. You don't wait for a user definition. You create this co-evolutionary context in which the knowledge of what's possible in technology then actually combines with the sort of micro-narrative, the unarticulated needs, the water cooler stories, the, oh my God, why can't I have something which does this type stories? And to my mind, that's kind of like the next major development in Agile and software development, is how do we actually feed the system a lot better? And that way we kind of like reduce the errors. So trios, unarticulated need mapping, there's a whole body of techniques being developed in that area. Equally, there's nothing wrong with traditional techniques like time boxes and other techniques. I mean, we can use them, they work. We just need to understand the context. So that was kind of like one of the principles of the Cynefin framework. Equally, as you move Agile out of software development into other areas, you can see how it works in the context of HR and marketing, where you have a project-based culture with a series of user-defined projects, where rapid iteration and rapid cycle iteration is going to produce better results. So huge tick in the box on that. But when you kind of like move into more complex issues, such as, for example, employee motivation, employee engagement, you're dealing with something far more complex, in which a short life cycle project focus is actually contraindicated, because in the effort to become agile, the effort to move quickly, you're going to lose some of the subtleties. And again, some of our work there is to map cultures, culture maps. Culture maps look like three-dimensional landscapes, and they indicate where the culture is, and kind of like what are the acceptable next steps. One of the things that we know, and anybody with basic anthropology can tell you this, is you can't engineer a culture. The minute people sit down in a workshop and say, we want to have culture type X, or we want to be this sort of an organization, you know they're going to fail, because what you're dealing with is a complex evolutionary process in which very small changes in the present can produce radically different and unexpected outcomes in the future. So kind of like key on agility within HR is the ability to understand where you are and what directions of travel are possible, rather than what goals you want to achieve. One of the ways I often express this is that what we need to do is to start journeys with a general sense of direction rather than trying to achieve goals. And that's kind of like a key difference. If you move into corporate strategy, This is kind of like one of the areas where I see the highest degree of naivety amongst agilists of various dimensions. I mean, I've worked in corporate strategies, both as a corporate strategy director in a major IT firm, and then at various levels in IBM over the years. And to be quite honest, a lot of corporate strategy is fundamentally about politics. There's a framework I created some time ago, which is called See, Attend, Act, which says, do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Will I act on the data? Are three completely separate processes. And often in strategy, you know what you want to do and you know what you want to achieve, but your organization isn't capable of achieving it. So you've got to get realistic. Or the political context of the society that you're in will not permit the moves you want. Or, and this is kind of like where I want to spend a bit of time, the time isn't right yet. So let me take you, and this is called apex predator theory for people who want to look it up in more detail. Let me go through a couple of key moves in the history of computers. So around about the 1940s, IBM does one of these radical repurposings I talked about earlier, repurposing something you're already very good at for something completely novel. So the thing IBM were really good at was punch cards. They used them to control weaving machines and sewing machines and industrial machines, all sorts of things. They were really good at it. And they realized that punch cards could be used to actually get first mover advantage in, at that time, a computer industry, which was only just starting to grow. Remember, if we go back to the moonshots and we're now on the 60s, you're still talking about significant human computation, as well as computer computation within the process. So it's kind of like early days. And for anybody who was around in the 80s and 90s, there was an adage then, nobody got fired for buying IBM. And the reason was IBM were the first mover into a novel space. And after they'd moved into that space, it became impossible for anybody to disrupt them for a considerable period of time. And this happens if you look at it in nature. So you get an apex predator, the top of the food chain. And the rest of the food chain sort of organizes around that apex predator who survives no matter how incompetent they are, until the ecosystem itself changes or gets disrupted. So if we go back in geological time, when the dinosaurs get wiped out by the meteor, it's not the shark or the crocodile who becomes the next apex predator, it's the first mammal, which is something really small and highly energy efficient, and nobody could have predicted that. And the same happens to IBM. So what happens is hardware becomes a commodity. IBM don't realize it, because if you're at the top of the food chain, your prices and your revenue streams maintain themselves long after their value has disappeared, until you get this catastrophic failure. I moved into IBM just after it had the largest then loss in American corporate history, because it hadn't realized the world had switched from hardware to software. Hardware had become a commodity. You just bought the cheapest because the quality levels were very similar. And IBM hadn't built a business model on that. Microsoft, on the other hand, repurposed the software they originally developed for IBM, for the IBM PC, to create Windows. And again, they became the next apex predator. It was Windows everywhere. Then software became a commodity. We get Apple. So it's critical in terms of strategy and change to realize there are times where being agile is critical and times where it's a complete waste of resources. So when you get high levels of commodification or radical disruption to the ecosystem, you need to be agile, but you need to be agile in parallel and in very unstructured ways. It's kind of like the deep structure of Scrum is not going to work in that environment. It's got too much structure for its purpose. But when you've got high levels of stability, then you can start to use more structured techniques, because you kind of like know what you've got to do. To some extent, and I'll go back to the example, in the 80s and 90s, the only available strategy was what I call a hyena strategy. You had to feed off the leavings of IBM. So you had to become IBM certified or IBM competent or whatever, and then you could sort of build a business because you were subsidiary to the apex. So timing is key, and understanding that is vital. And that leads me on to the final subject that I wanted to go through, which is crisis management. And if we've ever been in a crisis, well, kind of like we're in one now. The ecosystem, and I haven't been at Heathrow Airport now in 6 months, which is, given I used to travel 250 days of the year, is quite scary. We've all learned to manage without actual travel. We've learned that some things work better. So, for example, we found that our masterclasses or our retreats, we pre-record the keynotes so that people can listen to them several times. And then we use the virtual time for discussion. And that seems to work a lot better than just trying to run a conventional conference within a virtual environment. It's actually very difficult as a speaker when you can't see the audience, because you don't know whether you're going too fast or going too slow. You don't know whether they're getting it or not. But if you pre-record it, some people will listen to you 3 or 4 times, some people will listen once, and so on. We're also learning to use multiple environments. There's a whole software industry developing around virtual brainstorming in areas like that. We're increasingly looking at mass engagement, human sensor networks, looking at the subject in real time and looking at the map. So we've got a period of radical disruption, which creates a period of rapid innovation. But the issue you have to watch for is who will stabilize the new ecosystem. So the traditional players probably won't. I'll give you an example on this. I was using WebEx the other day, and I remember when WebEx was the standard for collaboration. And I suddenly realized I haven't used this in 6 months. Why is this company still using that when most of everybody else is on Zoom or Teamroom? Yeah. So the ecosystem is being disrupted. Radical new players are coming through. And the next apex predator is already there. We're just not quite sure who they are yet. Yeah? But trying to find them, form alliances, sort of move around them becomes key. Now, crisis management is kind of like a key part of this. And there are sort of 2 things. One thing you need to do quickly and one thing you should never do. And I'm not going to present Cynefin in this, but there's a whole series of blog posts on this. This is using the confused central domain of Cynefin, which is critical. So the first thing you do in a crisis is you rapidly impose rigid constraints in order to create some stability, which is going to allow you to move forwards. If you look at in the COVID crisis, the New Zealand Prime Minister did this quite well. So she introduced a total lockdown well before the evidence supported it. And the reason she did that is a lockdown kept our options open for longer. If you did what the UK and the US did, you waited till the evidence was overwhelming. By that time, it was too late to give you breathing space. You were actually still running behind the game. So kind of like move number 1 in a crisis is impose radical draconian constraints to create some space around what you're going to do. Yeah? Now that's critical. Yeah? What you absolutely don't do is that anybody who says, well, if only we had, or I told you all about this, or this is the way we always do things. Those sort of people need to be removed from the equation. Yeah. Now, the key about getting that sort of, in Cynefin terms, this is a move from chaos to confused. You've then effectively got a series of moves that you can do from that. So the first move is, I guarantee you, if you're in a crisis, somebody told you about that crisis in advance, and you actually had the opportunity to do something about it. Yeah? Now, if you didn't take that opportunity, now's the time to call them in and give them some resource and actually let them get away with it. You shouldn't feel guilty about this, because if you're a senior decision-making role, there are always a large group of experts who can tell you what you should be doing, and should move forward. So that's move number 1. If you've got conflicting expertise, you let them fight it out, and there are structured techniques for that. If you've got multiple hypotheses, you basically run experiments. And if you really don't know where to go, or you're not sure you've covered the hypotheses, you use a human sensor network to gain multiple perspectives on the situation and identify dominant and outlier views. Now, what I'll do in the workshop later on is expand on that in more detail. But this is a plea, as I conclude this, It's a plea for accepting this concept of requisite diversity, of actually realizing where you are, of understanding context, and adopting a multiple methods approach. Agile is very good in some areas, it's not very good in others. Scrum is very good in parts of Agile, it's not very good in others, and so on. So accept diversity, accept difference, accept interaction, and above all, remember that key word context. Context is everything. Thank you very much for your time.